So the last year of World War I was pretty important. There had been a few years of fighting prior to this, but in that final year, the United States actually gets involved. Okay, so they enter the war in 1917. Now, this is a really good thing because at the beginning here, before they decided to jump in, the Western Front, which if you guys remember, the Western Front was synonymous with the trenches. Okay, so trench warfare is what was the majority of warfare that was taking place in that region. Now, it was a nice little injection of new blood that allowed for kind of a reinvigoration. Now the European troops, they were kind of feeling a little bit listless. They were feeling a little bit hopeless. And now once the United States comes in, not only are they bringing more men to the front, but they're also bringing a whole heck of a lot of brand new equipment that's going to help give them more of an edge on their counterparts and push them towards victory. Now, one of the big things that also happens during this time, as you guys saw in your last lesson, is that Russia withdraws from the war. Now, of course, we know that's because Vladimir Lenin makes his way into Moscow. He gets the proletariat together, and they bring down the bourgeoisie. They get rid of the current power system in Russia, and they replace it with a communist government. So now they become one of the very first communist governments throughout the world. Now, of course, because they're worried about, trying to switch things over to this new type of society, fighting in a war doesn't really fit in too well. So the Russians, boom, they're gone. All right, so this kind of simplifies things a little bit for the Germans. That's one less enemy that they have to worry about. So now, with Russia gone, they're really making their big focus on the Western Front. So we see the Second Battle of the Marne, where they stop the German troops from entering Paris. So now Germany is starting to lose its momentum and starting to lose its ability to go on the offensive. The injection of American troops only makes that more and more difficult as we continue to move forward here. Not only are the Germans having trouble being offensive at this point, now with the American troops, they join in with the French troops and they start making their way into Germany. So now we're getting to a point where Germany is going to have to accept surrender as a thought. Now, as things are starting to draw to a close, we've already got people in the United States thinking about what the next steps are. But before they can actually end this war, they need to figure out, how are we going to end this? Okay? On what terms? Now, generally, when a war ends, there's an agreement signed between the two. There's a peace treaty. Now, sometimes there's kind of a bit of wheeling and dealing that goes along with them. So one country will surrender if, certain terms are met. And then if the other country agrees to that, they have a treaty, bing, bang, boom, the war is now completely done. In this particular instance, the United States kind of draws a line here. The rest of the allies follow suit, and they say they will not make peace with an autocratic German government. Essentially what they were saying is that they needed to create a government that was more in line with what was going on in the other allied states. So, they would not make peace unless there was a new government in place. So, what do they have to do? Well, we've got the workers, we've got the soldiers. They all kind of come together and they create a new liberal, democratic government. The democratic portion of this really was the big term that the Allies were trying to push for. They wanted to have a democratic government rather than something that's autocratic or kind of specifically run by one person or one very small group of people. So the new German government signs an armistice. Okay, so essentially Germany surrendered and the war has come to a close. So what does that mean for them next? So out in Europe, after this war ends, there is a lot of confusion. But there's also a lot of groups of people that want to kind of fight for their own freedom. They want to change the way that their government works. Now, in particular, with Germany, we see kind of a new radicalist government or a new radicalist group of people starting to get together. Okay. We're going to see multiple parties kind of come together and start pushing their way in. But the first one that we see is the German Communist Party. Okay, so this goes hand in hand with kind of the hammer and sickle, the Communist Party that was a part of Russia. The idea of communism, especially after the war, starts to become a little bit more popular as a way to make sure that everybody is fully taken care of. Now, despite the fact that it was becoming more and more of a popular idea, it still wasn't ready to reach prime time just yet. And so many of these communist rebellions are indeed crushed by the Germans. But they are also left with a fear of communism. So there are certain people that feel a very specific way about this. Some of them are very pro, but for the most part, the majority of the Germans are against the concept of communism. They're going to start to rethink how they feel really quickly, though, after we talk about what happens with the Treaty of Versailles, what the Germans have to do in order to continue to maintain peace throughout the world. Now, Austria-Hungary, they also see some instances of revolution attempted. Okay? Overall, we see Austria-Hungary ceasing to exist, and so we have two different nations here. We've got Austria, we've got Hungary, and then to add on to that, we also see Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia created as a result of this war. So things are changing quite a bit out there in Europe. Now, like I said, before this war was even done, you have to realize that there are a lot of forces at work here. There are people that are trying to figure out what the tactics are for the next battle, but there are some people that are thinking even further on down the line to the end of the war. Now, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States of America, he starts thinking about the concept of the 14 points. Now, the 14 points are pretty simple here. These are just 14 steps that he puts in place to try to not only keep a peace throughout the world, but to prevent something like another world war from happening. Now, of course, from historical hindsight, we know that Wilson wasn't terribly successful at doing this, but the ideas initially kind of seemed pretty sound. Okay, wanted to make sure that reaching peace agreements happened openly, so there weren't any secret meetings or backdoor deals being done in order to achieve peace between different countries. Okay, reducing armaments. So if you guys remember, there was that whole thing called militarism, and that was one of the main ideas or the main things that started up the war to begin with. So militarism had a lot to do with building up your military, building up your armaments. Okay, so armaments essentially means weapons. So they want to reduce the amount of armaments or the amount of weapons that each country has to try to even everything out and make sure that nobody is really a lot more powerful than their counterparts. Okay, that would stop them from starting up a whole nother war. And then ensuring the right of people to have their own independent nation. Okay, this kind of goes into what we've talked about with the Bill of Rights and with the Declaration of Independence and with the Enlightenment, the idea of the right of the people to have their own independent government, the right of the people. That's a big deal. They need to consent to that government. So this was kind of a way of Wilson trying to spread democracy out further and further. Now, the big thing that he wanted to do is he wanted to create a council. He wanted to create a group of people that would essentially stop any other type of conflict from taking hold across the entire world. And he called this the League of Nations. Now, what this meant is that gone will be the alliance system. Gone will be all of these other things that threw everybody out of balance. So if one country has a problem with another country, their representatives within the League of Nations would get together, they would talk, they would try to work things out diplomatically rather than just going right to a fight. Going right to a fight would essentially get us right back into a whole worldwide conflict. Okay? And this would stop there having to be backdoor deals for alliances. So now it's not so much about having your best buddy, your big best buddy, or your older brother or something like that trying to protect you. Now it was just everybody kind of sitting at a round table and trying to deal with each other and figure out how they were going to live peacefully and coexist with each other on a day-to-day basis. Now, this idea was very popular, but the one place that the 14 points and specifically the League of Nations, it was not popular in the USA. In fact, for all of the work that Woodrow Wilson does to get that passed, it doesn't actually work. So the League of Nations does indeed get created, but we are not a part of it. Now, the Paris Peace Conference. So we've got a group of people that are coming together to try to figure out what to do next. We can see them all just kind of chilling over here in the picture. So these are our big four. Georges Clemenceau. He was the French premier. Okay, he lived through 2 German invasions. He was determined to avoid another invasion by the Germans. We've got David Lloyd George. Okay, so he's from Great Britain. He is the prime minister. Okay, his thought was to make Germany pay. Now, this was not really an uncommon thought. George Clemenceau was very much in the same boat, as well as Vittorio Orlando. So each of these guys, they got together, and of course, Woodrow Wilson, he's there as well. He's part of that big four. These guys wanted to stick it to Germany. They were upset. Like I said, George Clemenceau, he lived through 2 German invasions. The Germans loved trying to mess with France, and as we know, with World War II, this certainly would not be the last time that they were going to mess with France. He is very much wanting to try to cut the legs out from underneath Germany to make sure that they don't ever become a threat ever again. Vittorio Orlando, he had a little bit of a different motive, though he did definitely want to make Germany pay, but he wanted to get some of that nice, sweet control over Austrian territory. So the war would benefit him not only by getting rid of his enemies and kind of making them a little bit more powerless, but now he gets a little bit of land to add a little bit of a cherry to the top of that sundae. Now, the 4 men that are considered the Big Four, they did not include the Central Powers or Russia. Now, remember, because sometimes people tend to forget, that Russia was actually considered to be one of the allies. So they were not included at all in these considerations, but also the Central Powers. So Germany, okay, and everybody else that was with them, they were not included. So normally, with a treaty, you come to a deal. That was not the case here. So these 4 countries decided, without any input whatsoever from both Russia and from Germany, as to what they were going to force them to do and what type of concessions that they would have to make. So as this war comes to an end, the Allies create the Treaty of Versailles. Now, history is going to be looking back on this document as something that is directly responsible for the beginning of World War II. So let's talk about what happened with this treaty and how it really did start setting the precedent for this next World War. First and foremost, it established 9 new nations. Okay, those nations are Austria, Yugoslavia, Lithuania, Latvia, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, and Finland. So there's quite a few nations that came out of this. Now, where did all this land come from? Because it didn't just magically appear. This is where we start to see our first issues with the fact that they did not include not only the Central Powers, but Russia. A lot of this land was taken from Russia. Okay, so Russia loses a lot of their land. Now, that's kind of curious, right? Because if we think about this, they won. Kind of. You know, they had to back out of the war, but they were technically on the side of the Allies. So shouldn't they not lose their land? In this particular case, it just didn't happen. So these guys lost a bunch of their land. So they're not going to be thrilled moving forward, and they're going to want to start getting some of that land back. Now, carved out 5 areas out of the Ottoman Empire to give to Britain and France. So now these were territories of these two countries. So they could make money off of them. They could express their influence over them. Pretty much all that stuff that we talked about when we talked about imperialism. They barred Germany from maintaining an army. So they did not want Germany to have a standing army. Nothing that would be able to compete in another war once again. It also required Germany to take the blame for a lot of things. Okay? First and foremost, they had to return some land to France. But as they agreed to this, part of the treaty was called the War Guilt Clause. So that put the entire blame for all of World War I onto Germany. So Germany is fully responsible for the whole kit and caboodle, which means that they've got $33 billion that has to be paid back, and that's going to come right from Germany. So that's definitely going to cause some issues. It's going to put financially Germany into a really rough spot, but the inability for Germany to pay this back to the other allied countries is going to start putting them into some economic troubles as well. So overall, this document, it shifts a lot of blame, and more importantly, it really just sticks it to Germany. Exactly what the Big Four wanted. At the very least, 3 of the Big Four wanted to stick it to Germany. They did a great job of it. Okay, so the treatment of Germany weakened the ability of the treaty to keep lasting peace in Europe. Okay, as you can see, we've got this very, very angry German here. He's not thrilled with how everything's going. Okay, because what I said in the last slide, the War Guilt Clause. So this forces Germany to admit sole responsibility for the war. So now we've really got to think about this, right? We look at the main ideas. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Was Germany guilty of all of these things? Yes. Yes, they absolutely were. Were they the only ones that were doing these things? Absolutely not. Okay, so a lot of other companies were participating in these things. If we think about what actually started the war, okay, we look at the Serbian nationalist who killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Did that really have a lot to do with Germany? No, not particularly. Okay, it was more of a disagreement with the Austria-Hungarians and the Serbians. Nothing to do with Germany. So interesting. They get the entire war blamed on them. They have to pay that $33 billion, which they actually only recently paid back in 2010. So 2010, the Treaty of Versailles was finally paid off. Germany is stripped of their colonial possessions. So any of the land that they had acquired before this war, that was gone. And that, again, made it really hard for them to pay their reparations because all of the stuff that they got from there, the raw materials, they could not sell that and use that money to pay off their reparations. So this puts them in a really precarious situation. It's only going to get worse when the Great Depression hits in the 1930s. From there, we are going to see a very large power vacuum, but also a desperation within the people that is going to allow them to accept some more extreme ideas than they might have originally, especially because the person who is expressing these ideas is actually doing a good job of helping their nation to recover. To a certain extent, you can't argue with results, and it's because of that that we're going to start to see some more extreme people taking hold within Germany specifically. All right, so as we look at the legacies of the war, really the big thing with World War I is that it really did change the face of what warfare looked like in the modern day. This is a war that started off on horseback and ended in the air and on tanks and with motorized vehicles. Okay? All of this stuff changed immensely in just a few years' time. But the Treaty of Versailles really becomes one of the big lasting legacies of this war because it gives the ability for extremists like this guy right here. We've got Adolf Hitler. Okay, it gives him room to gain power and to get people to start following a type of government and a type of thought process that is incredibly dangerous. And this all happens because Germany is unstable. They can't pay back their reparations. So economic turmoil, the Great Depression, is going to be one of the big ways that this guy right here manages to make his way in and get people back up on their feet and get them believing in the ideas of Nazism. Russia is left out of those peace talks. Okay, this is going to get them riled up. They want to get some of their land back, and because of that, that's going to put Stalin, who is the leader of Russia, in a position to be in cahoots, at least to a certain extent, with Adolf Hitler. So we're also going to see multiple governments throughout all of these different countries that have been created. We're going to see many of them rise, and we're going to see many of them fall. So overall, this war really is kind of that transition into the modern era, but it also sets the stage for World War II. And as we move forward, we're going to take a look and see exactly how that happened. We're going to see the rise of some of the dictators like Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, and all of those folks that really start changing the world and bring us even further into that modern age. But for today, we'll end it with this, and we will get jumping onto World War II very quickly.